The stars had never seemed so cold to Ambassador Viral as she stood on the observation deck of the massive warship called the Endless Sovereignty, watching the small blue and green planets spin slowly beneath them in the endless dark of space. She had studied this world in the ancient databases that her people kept hidden in their most secure archives, and she knew what the records said about it. A Class 12 death world, one of the most dangerous categories that existed in all the known galaxy. Home to a species that called themselves humans. The gravity on that world was crushing and heavy. The atmosphere was filled with a corrosive gas called oxygen that would burn the lungs of most species. The surface was covered with predators and parasites and diseases that killed without mercy. And the dominant species had evolved through millions of years of brutal competition where only the strongest and most cunning survived. But the records also said that these humans were primitive and backward, barely capable of leaving their own moon. Certainly no threat to the mighty Cathari dominion that had conquered 1,000 star systems and ruled over dozens of subject species. With an iron grip, High Commander Zorath stood at the center of the bridge with his 4 arms crossed over his chest and his yellow eyes gleaming with the day. Arrogance that came from centuries of easy victories against weaker foes. And he looked at the blue world below with nothing but contempt in his expression. This system contains vast deposits of rare minerals that our empire needs, he announced to the assembled officers in his deep rumbling voice. And I see no reason why we should waste time negotiating with primitive creatures who cannot even defend their own planet. Ambassador Viral stepped forward with concern written across her pale features. A diplomatic training telling her that something about this situation felt deeply wrong in ways she could not quite explain. High Commander, she said carefully, the ancient protocols suggest that we should attempt communication before taking any aggressive action, especially with a Deathworld species, whose capabilities may not be fully documented in our records. Zorath turned his massive head toward her and let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl. Dismissing her concerns with a wave of one of his clawed hands, the records show that these humans have barely changed in 200 years. He replied with absolute certainty. They are still fighting among themselves with primitive weapons while we command fleets that can crack planets. And I will not waste the Dominion's time treating with animals. At that moment, the communication officer announced that the humans were transmitting signals toward the fleet. Desperate attempts at contact that repeated over and over in dozens of different formats and frequencies, clearly begging for a chance to communicate. The messages were translated by the ship's systems, and Viral listened to the human voices pleading for dialogue, asking why the alien ships had come, offering friendship and peaceful exchange. And she felt something twist in her stomach as she watched Zorath's face twist into a cruel smile. They are afraid, the High Commander said with satisfaction, as they should be. And now we will teach them the price of occupying a system that the Dominion requires. He turned to his weapons officer and gave the order that would change the history of the galaxy forever, commanding the fleet to fire upon 3 of the largest coastal population centers on the planet below as a demonstration of power that would force the humans to surrender without further resistance. Viral opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat as brilliant beams of energy lanced down from the orbiting warships, punching through the planet's atmosphere and striking the surface with the force of 100 nuclear explosions combined into each terrible blast. The cities of New Shanghai and São Paulo and Lagos vanished in expanding spheres of fire and destruction. 12 million human beings dying in the span of heartbeats. Their lives erased as casually as one might brush dust from a table on the bridge of the Endless Sovereignty. Zorath watched the destruction with cold satisfaction while his officers cheered and congratulated themselves on their easy victory over a primitive species that had never stood a chance against their superior technology, but Ambassador Varel stood frozen at the observation window, watching the mushroom clouds rise over the burning planet. And she felt a terrible certainty growing in her mind that they had just made a mistake beyond any possible redemption. What? None of them knew. What no one in the entire Galactic Compact had bothered to verify in over 2 centuries was that the humans had not been idle during all those years of apparent primitiveness and internal conflict. They had found something in the deep deserts of their world. A crashed vessel from a species called the Valkorians who had visited their system long ago and met with an unfortunate accident. And the humans had done what humans had always done throughout their long and bloody history. They had learned and adapted and overcome. For 60 years they had worked in secret, building shipyards hidden in the asteroid belt where no alien sensors had thought to look, reverse engineering the alien technology until they understood it better than its creators, improving upon designs that other species had considered perfect for millennia. They had known that the galaxy would find them eventually, and they had known that the galaxy would not be kind to a Deathworld species that had clawed its way to sentience through endless ages of competition and violence. So they had prepared, quietly and patiently, building a fleet that they hoped they would never need to use, training soldiers who prayed they would never have to fight, creating weapons that they wished would rust in storage forever. And now, as the ashes of 12 million dead settled over the ruins of 3 great cities, as families screamed for loved ones who would never answer, as children wandered through the rubble calling for parents who had been vaporized in an instant, the humans made their decision. The transmission came 37 minutes after the bombardment ended, broadcast on every known frequency and in every language that human linguists had been able to decode from intercepted alien communications over the decades of secret preparation. It was not a plea for mercy or a desperate offer of surrender, and it was not the panicked response of a primitive species that had just learned its place in the cosmic order. It was simply 7 words, spoken in a calm and steady voice that contained no fear and no desperation and no uncertainty of any kind. Just a cold and absolute promise that made Ambassador Varel's blood freeze in her veins. You have made a terrible mistake, and somewhere in the asteroid belt, hidden shipyard doors began to open for the first time in 60 years. 6 weeks passed after the bombardment, and the Cathari mining operation proceeded with the cold efficiency that had made the Dominion feared across 1,000 star systems, with massive extraction vessels descending to the wounded planet to begin stripping away its precious resources. High Commander Zorth had dismissed the strange human transmission as nothing more than the desperate bluster of a doomed species, the kind of empty threat that primitive civilizations always made when they realized that their world was no longer their own. He had seen this pattern 100 times before in his long career of conquest, and he expected the humans to either surrender completely or launch pathetic attacks with their primitive weapons that would be swatted aside like annoying insects. The reports that filtered back to the Dominion homeworld were filled with confidence and self-congratulation, praising Zoreth for his decisive action and predicting that the human system would be fully integrated into the Empire within a single standard year. But Ambassador Viral could not shake the feeling of dread that had settled into her bones like a sickness that would not fade, and she spent her days studying every piece of information about humans that existed in the Dominion's vast databases. What she found disturbed her more than she could express in words, for the humans had a history unlike any species the galaxy had ever encountered before. They had survived ice ages that froze their world solid. They had survived volcanic eruptions that blocked out their sun for years. They had survived asteroid impacts and plagues and famines and floods, and most terrifying of all, they had survived each other, fighting endless wars throughout their history, with weapons that grew more destructive with each generation. developing tactics and strategies through thousands of years of brutal conflict against the most dangerous enemy they had ever faced, themselves. Then the disappearances began, and Viral felt the cold certainty of doom settling over the fleet. Like a shroud, it started with a patrol vessel on the outer edge of the system, a small ship with a crew of 40 that simply stopped responding to communications one day and was never heard from again. Sareth ordered a search, and the searchers found nothing. Not a single piece of debris or distress signal, or any indication of what had happened to the missing vessel a week later. A supply convoy vanished in the same region of space. 3 cargo ships and their escort that had been carrying refined minerals back to Dominion territory. And once again, the search teams found nothing but empty void. The High Commander's confidence began to crack around the edges as more reports came in. Another patrol missing, a scout ship that had sent a single garbled transmission before going silent, a refueling station on a distant moon that stopped responding and was found completely empty when investigators Aravedzaruth told his officers that the losses were due to equipment failures and navigation errors, the kind of accidents that happened in any large military operation. But Viral saw the fear growing in his yellow eyes whenever a new report of missing ships crossed his desk. She requested permission to open diplomatic channels with the humans, arguing that perhaps they could negotiate an end to whatever was happening before the situation grew worse. And Zoreth denied her request with a snarl of anger that barely concealed his growing terror. "We do not negotiate with primitives," he declared. "And I will not show weakness to animals, who should be grateful we allow them to continue existing at all." But the disappearances continued, and the crews of the remaining ships began to whisper among themselves about ghosts in the void and ancient curses and the terrible vengeance of a wounded world on the 42nd day after the bombardment. A Cathari science vessel managed to recover a fragment of data from the black box of a destroyed patrol ship. And what they found changed everything. The bridge crew of the Endless Sovereignty gathered around the main display screen as the corrupted footage played, showing the final moments of the patrol ship from the perspective of its internal cameras. At first there was nothing unusual, just the normal routine of a vessel on a standard patrol route through the outer system. But then the sensor officer began shouting about an anomaly, and the captain ordered battle stations. The footage showed something emerging from what appeared to be folded space itself, a technology that the greatest scientists of the Galactic Compact had theorized about for centuries, but never managed to achieve. And Viral felt her heart stop beating as the ship came into view. It was massive and angular and painted in colors so dark that it seemed to drink in the light around it, bristling with weapons that pulsed with barely contained energy, moving through the void with the silent grace of a predator that had finally found its prey. The design was unlike anything in the Dominion's databases, brutal and efficient and utterly without the elegant curves that most spacefaring species favored in their vessels. As if the builders had cared nothing for beauty and everything for function, the patrol ship opened fire with everything it had, and the beams that should have torn through any known vessel simply splashed against the dark hull like water against stone, absorbed by armor plating so thick and dense that it seemed impossible. Then the human ship returned fire, and the display filled with light so bright that it overwhelmed the camera sensors for a moment. And when the image cleared, the patrol vessel was already breaking apart. The last frame of the footage was burned into Varel's memory forever, showing the hull of the human ship in terrible clarity as it passed by the dying patrol vessel, and she could see text stenciled on the dark metal in the angular script of the human language. The translation software provided the meaning in cold, mechanical text. When Nemesisareth stared at the frozen image for a long moment before turning to his officers with fear finally breaking through the mask of arrogance he had worn for so long, "Send word to the homeworld," he commanded in a voice that trembled slightly despite his efforts to control it. "Tell them to send every available warship to this system immediately. and tell them that the humans are not what we thought they were. Ambassador Viral watched him give the orders and knew with absolute certainty that it was already far too late for reinforcements to make any difference. The hunters had become the hunted. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the humans were waiting. The reinforcements arrived 3 weeks later. 47 warships of the Cathari Dominion assembling in defensive formation around the blue-green world that had cost them so many vessels and so many lives already. It was the largest concentration of military power that the Dominion had deployed in 3 generations. A fleet capable of reducing entire planets to ash, crewed by soldiers who had never known defeat against any enemy they had faced. High Commander Zorath stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the massive formation take shape around him. And he felt his confidence returning as he counted the weapons platforms and carrier vessels and heavy cruisers that had answered his call for aid. The humans had surprised him with their hidden technology and their ghost ships that struck from nowhere and vanished into the void. But surely no primitive species could stand against this much firepower, no matter what tricks they had developed, Ambassador. Viral stood at the back of the bridge with her hands clasped behind her back and her expression carefully neutral, hiding the terror that churned in her stomach as she watched Zorath preen and boast about the destruction he would bring upon the humans. She had continued her research during the weeks of waiting, digging deeper into the ancient archives than any Cathari diplomat had ever gone before. And what she had learned about Deathworld species had stolen her sleep and filled her dreams with nightmares. These were not creatures that surrendered when faced with superior force, for they had evolved on worlds where surrender meant death, and only the most stubborn and vicious survived to pass on their traits to the next generation. They fought until they won or died. And even death was not always enough to stop them from taking their enemies with them into the darkness. The sensor officer announced contacts at the edge of the system, and the bridge fell silent as everyone turned to the main display, watching the indicators multiply as more and more signatures appeared from nowhere. Space itself seemed to tear open in 17 different locations at once. And Viral had to look away from the screen as the rifts formed, because there was something fundamentally wrong about them. Something that hurt her eyes and made her mind rebel against what it was seeing. The ships that emerged from those wounds in reality were nightmares given form. Massive angular vessels covered in armor plating so thick that it doubled the width of their hulls. Bristling with weapons that glowed with barely contained fury, they were brutal and ugly and utterly terrifying. Designed without any concern for elegance or aesthetics. Built for one purpose and one purpose only: to destroy anything that stood against them. Zorath stared at the display, and his yellow eyes went wide as he counted the enemy vessels. For there were only 23 human ships against his fleet of 47. And he felt a surge of relief at the realization that he still outnumbered them by nearly 2 to 1. All ships opened fire. He commanded with triumph in his voice. Destroy these primitives and end this farce once and for all. The Cathari fleet unleashed everything it had in a single devastating volley. Thousands of energy beams and missiles and plasma torpedoes, racing across the void toward the human formation in a wave of destruction that should have vaporized any fleet. In the known galaxy, Admiral Helena Vance stood on the bridge of the UEN. Retribution with her hands clasped behind her back and her gray eyes cold as she watched the enemy fire approach. And she felt nothing but calm certainty as the weapons reached her ships. She had lost her sister in New Shanghai, vaporized along with 3 million other souls by the aliens, who had not even bothered to try talking before they started killing her. Tactical officer had lost his entire family in Snow Hollow. His parents and his wife and his 2 young children erased from existence in a single heartbeat of alien arrogance. Every single person in the United Earth Navy fleet had lost someone they loved in the bombardment, and they had spent the weeks since then preparing for this moment with a cold and patient fury that no alien species could ever truly understand. Cathari weapons struck the human ships, and void lit up with explosions that should have torn through hull plating and detonated reactors and killed everyone aboard. But when the light faded, the human vessels were still there. Their armor was scorched and pitted in places, but intact. Ablative plating designed to absorb and dissipate exactly this kind of attack, developed through decades of secret research and preparation for the day when humanity would have to fight for its survival. "Return fire," Admiral Vance commanded in a voice like winter ice. All ships engage at will. The human fleet answered with a roar of weapons that made the Cathari volley look like a gentle rain. Kinetic accelerators firing depleted uranium rounds at a significant fraction of light speed. Nuclear-tipped torpedoes that detonated against enemy shields with the fury of 1,000 suns. And beam weapons that cut through hull plating like scissors through paper. The first Cathari warship died in seconds. Its shields overwhelmed and its hull breached in a dozen places simultaneously. And before its crew could even begin to abandon ship, the reactor went critical, and the vessel vanished in a ball of expanding plasma. Then the second ship died, and the third, and the fourth, and the void filled with the debris of shattered warships and the screaming transmissions of dying crews as the human fleet carved through the Cathari formation like wolves through a flock of sheepsarith, screamed orders that no one could follow, and watched his magnificent fleet torn apart by vessels that outnumbered them by less than half. Unable to understand how this was possible, unable to accept that everything he believed about the universe was wrong, the battle lasted 11 minutes from the first shot to the last surrender. And when it was over, 39 Cathari warships were nothing but expanding clouds of debris and frozen bodies, while the remaining 8 drifted helplessly, with their weapons destroyed and their engines. Then Admiral Vance looked at the carnage on her display and felt no satisfaction or joy, only a grim sense of duty completed and a cold promise kept to the 12 million dead who would never see justice but would at least have vengeance. "Secure the prisoners," she ordered, "and find me the one called Zorath. I want him alive to stand trial for what he did." Ambassador Viral floated in an escape pod, watching the human ships move through the wreckage with terrible efficiency. And she finally understood what the ancient databases had tried to warn her people about so long ago, that Deathworlders did not simply survive their hellish homeworlds through luck or accident. They were forged by them, hammered into something harder and sharper and more dangerous than any species that had evolved in gentler circumstances could ever hope to match. And now the galaxy would learn what happened when you made enemies of creatures who had been fighting for their survival since before they learned to walk upright. The news of the battle spread through the galactic compact like fire through dry grass, traveling from system to system at the speed of the fastest courier ships, growing more terrifying with each retelling until the truth was almost lost beneath layers of rumor and legend. The Cathari Dominion, one of the 12 great powers that had ruled the galaxy for millennia, had sent 47 of their finest warships to crush a primitive species that had dared to threaten them. And in less than 15 minutes, those ships had been reduced to scattered debris, and surrendered Hulk's emergency councils were convened on 100 different worlds as governments scrambled to understand what had happened and what it meant for the careful balance of power that had maintained stability in the compact for thousands of years. Some called for immediate war against the humans, arguing that this upstart species must be destroyed before they grew powerful enough to threaten the established order, while others counseled patience and observation until more information could be gathered. The Vorax hegemony was loudest in calling for blood. For the Vorax were a proud warrior species who had never known defeat in their long history of conquest. And they saw the human victory as an insult that could not be allowed to stand unchallenged. But while the galaxy debated and argued and formed committees to study the situation, the humans were already moving with the decisive speed that had characterized their species. Throughout their violent history, one standard month after the battle, human warships appeared in the capital systems of all 12 great powers simultaneously, emerging from their impossible fold space drives without warning and taking up positions just outside weapons range of the most important worlds in the galaxy. They did not fire a single shot or make any aggressive moves, but their presence sent a message that no species could misunderstand. The humans could strike anywhere they chose, at any time they chose, and there was nothing the great powers could do to stop them. Human ambassadors were dispatched to each government with terms that were simple and non-negotiable, delivered in calm voices that carried the weight of absolute certainty behind every word. Humanity demanded recognition as a sovereign power with all the rights and privileges that entailed, including a seat on the Grand Assembly and protection under the laws of the Compact. They demanded reparations for the unprovoked attack on their world, not in treasure or territory, but in technology and knowledge that would help them rebuild the cities that had been destroyed. They demanded that High Commander Zorath and the officers who had ordered the Commander Zorath and the Otter Zorath and the officers who had ordered the bombardment be turned over to human custody to face trial for crimes against humanity, with the promise that they would receive fair treatment under human law. They demanded that the Galactic Compact acknowledge a new principle that would be added to the laws governing relations between species. Any unprovoked attack on human civilians would be met with overwhelming and disproportionate retaliation against the military forces responsible. Most of the great powers received these demands with shock and outrage, unable to believe that a species so recently emerged from primitiveness would dare to dictate terms to civilizations that had ruled the stars for millennia. But they had all seen the recordings of the battle. They had all heard the reports of Cathari warships being torn apart by weapons that cut through their shields like they were not even there. And one by one they began to calculate the cost of defiance. The Vorax hegemony was the exception, for their pride would not allow them to bow before any species, no matter how dangerous. And when the human diplomatic vessel arrived in their home system, they responded with characteristic directness. The hegemony warship that destroyed the human ambassador's vessel was one of their finest, crewed by veterans of a dozen campaigns, and its captain sent a message to the human fleet mocking their threats and daring them to seek revenge. 3 standard days later, the human fleet returned to Vorax Prime in force, and the galaxy watched in horrified fascination as the Deathworlders demonstrated exactly what they were capable of when properly motivated. The humans did not glass the Vorax homeworld or bombard their cities or slaughter their civilians, for they were not the monsters that so many species had assumed them to be based on their classification as Deathworlders. Instead, they did something far more terrifying. They systematically dismantled every piece of military infrastructure in the Vorax system with surgical precision that seemed almost impossible for such a young species. Orbital defense platforms were disabled and captured rather than destroyed, their crews taken prisoner. Without a single Vorax life being lost, shipyards were occupied by human marines in heavy-powered armor who shrugged off Vorax weapons like they were toys and moved through corridors with the efficient brutality of apex predators who had finally found prey worth hunting. The entire Vorax home fleet, 32 warships that had never known defeat, was captured intact through boarding action so fast and overwhelming that most crews surrendered before they could even reach their weapons lockers. And when it was over, Admiral Helen Vance broadcast A message to every receiver in the galaxy on every frequency that human technology could reach. We are not monsters, she said in a voice that carried across the stars like the tolling of a great bell. We do not murder civilians and we do not seek conquest. But we remember everything and we repay every debt that is owed to us. The Vorax hegemony will have their fleet returned to them in 1 standard year. Once they have agreed to our terms and provided justice for the ambassador they murdered. Any other power that wishes to test our resolve is welcome to try. And we will respond the same way we have responded here. With overwhelming force applied to military targets only. We did not ask for this war. But we will finish it on our terms. The galaxy fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. And one by one the great powers began to reconsider their positions. No one else wanted to test the Deathworlders. No one else wanted to learn what 12 million murdered humans had bought with their deaths. 1 standard year had passed since the destruction of the Vorax fleet. And the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted when a foolish commander had ordered the bombardment of a world he considered primitive. And beneath his notice ambassador Viral stood in the grand assembly of the Galactic Compact, surrounded by representatives of hundreds of species who had gathered to witness history being made. And she watched as the human delegation entered the chamber for the first time. They walked with quiet confidence. These Deathworlders from the blue-green world that had nearly been destroyed by Cathari arrogance. And every eye in the vast chamber followed their progress toward the speaking platform at the center. The human ambassador was a woman named Sarah Chun, and she moved through the crowd of alien species without showing any sign of fear or intimidation despite being surrounded by creatures that could have crushed her with a presto. Single blow her species had spent 200 years hiding in fear of this moment, building in secret and praying that they would never be discovered by a galaxy that had classified their homeworld as a place of monsters and death. Now they walked among the great powers as equals. And Viral could see the mixture of fear and respect in the eyes of the assembled representatives as they watched the humans take their place. Admiral Helena Vance accompanied the delegation as humanity's military attache, her gray hair cut short and her uniform decorated with medals. That meant nothing to the alien observers, but everything to the soldiers who had fought under her. Command Girl had spoken with the Admiral several times during the past year, trying to understand these strange creatures who had proven themselves so terrifying in war, yet so restrained in victory. During their most recent conversation, Vance had explained something that had confused the ambassador for months. Why the humans had not simply conquered the species that had attacked them. We spent 200 years hiding because we knew what the galaxy would think of us, Vance had said in her quiet, steady voice. Deathworlders, monsters, creatures to be feared and destroyed before we could spread our violence to the stars. We built our fleet hoping we would never need to use it, praying that somehow the galaxy would give us a chance to prove that we were more than the world that had forged us. The Admiral had paused then, and Viral had seen something ancient and sad pass across her weathered features like clouds moving across a stormy sky. But you killed 12 million of our people without even trying to talk first. And we could not let that stand. We had to make sure that nothing like that could ever happen again. So we did what humans have always done when someone hurts us. We hurt them back harder, but we tried to be better than our nature while doing it. Viral had not fully understood then. But watching the human delegation move through the Grand Assembly, she began to see what Vance had meant. The trial of High Commander Zorath had been conducted with scrupulous fairness, with observers from every major power watching to ensure that justice was served according to proper legal standards. Evidence had been presented calmly and thoroughly. Recordings of the bombardment and the transmissions that had preceded it. Testimony from survivors and witnesses. documentation of the orders that Zorath had given. He had been found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment on a human penal colony, where he would be treated humanely, but would never again have the power to order the deaths of innocents. The humans had not executed him, despite the demands of their own people for blood, choosing instead to demonstrate that they could be better than the rage that burned in their hearts. It was perhaps the most impressive thing that Viral had ever witnessed. A species that had every reason to be monsters, choosing instead to be something more. Grand Assembly called for order, and the vast chamber fell silent as Ambassador Chum stepped up to the speaking platform and looked out over the sea of alien faces that surrounded her. 1 year ago, my people were attacked without provocation by a power that considered us primitive and beneath notice. She began in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room. 12 million humans died in that attack. Mothers and fathers and children who had done nothing wrong except live on a world that someone else wanted to claim. We responded as we had to respond, as any species would respond when their people are murdered. And we demonstrated that we are capable of defending ourselves against any threat. But we did not come here today seeking conquest or vengeance or domination over the species that hurt us. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the assembled representatives, meeting the eyes of those who watched her with fear and those who watched her with grudging respect. We came here today seeking what we have always wanted. A place among the stars where we can live in peace with our neighbors, where our children can grow up without fear, where the galaxy can become a home instead of a threat. We know what you call us. Deathworlders, monsters, creatures forged in violence, who cannot be trusted with anything except destruction. But we ask you to look at what we have done since we revealed ourselves, and judge us not by the world that made us, but by the choices we have made. We could have destroyed the Cathari fleet down to the last ship, but we accepted their surrender and treated their prisoners with dignity. We could have burned the Vorix homeworld to ash for the murder of our ambassador, but instead we took their fleet and returned it when they agreed to make peace. We could have used our technology to conquer and enslave, but instead we stand before you asking only for the same rights that every other species enjoys under the laws of the Compact. We are Deathworlders. Yes, but we are also more than that. We are survivors. We are builders. We are dreamers who looked up at the stars for thousands of years and wondered if we would ever find our place among them. The Grand Assembly voted unanimously to admit humanity as the 13th great power, the first new member in over 4,000 years of galactic history. No, one wanted to be the species that voted against the Deathworlders. But Viral suspected that was not the only reason for the unanimous result. Perhaps some of the representatives had seen something in Ambassador Chun's words that resonated with their own hopes and fears. A reminder that even the most dangerous species could choose to be more than their nature demanded as the humans took their seats among the assembled powers. Viral reflected on the lesson that the galaxy had learned at such terrible cost. Humans had a saying that had spread across 1,000 worlds in the past year, translated into every language and taught in every military academy as a warning to those who might consider attacking them. We do not start wars, but we finish them. The Cathari had made one mistake, underestimating what a Deathworld species was capable of when pushed to the edge of extinction. That mistake had cost them their fleet and their pride and their place as one of the dominant powers in the galaxy, but it had given the humans something that they had been waiting 200 years to claim: a home among the stars, earned through blood and fire and the terrible price of 12 million lives. And somewhere in the depths of human space, far from the watching eyes of the Compact, the shipyards continued their endless work. The humans had learned to hope for the best, but they would never again be caught unprepared for the worst. That was what it meant to be a Deathworlder: to survive everything the universe could throw at you, and to keep building toward a future that was worth fighting for.